Welcome back to Test Tuesday. Last week we started having a look at a few different screws commonly used into the edge of MDF boards. Something that can be quite problematic is screwing into the edge of MDF because it can tend to split the board and various other things. Today we're going to run a few more tests and then I'll take you through all of the results and tell you what I think is the outright winner. Today's tests are almost exactly the same as last week, but there's a whole load of extra stuff that I'll tell you about later on. The main difference of today's tests that you're going to see is that we're seeing what difference it makes adding a pilot hole before putting the screws into the MDF. Right, let's go for it. So, this is the 4x16 little control test, and this time with the pilot hole. Interesting. 39 kilos. That's blitzed it compared to the test we did without the pilot hole. I am going to run this one and the last one a couple more times because the results are so different, and we'll report back at the end of all this and we'll see what the final verdict is. But 39 kilos peak. Big improvement with the pilot hole. Interesting. Right, drywall screw with the pilot hole this time. Interestingly, even with the pilot, it has cracked the MDF a tiny bit, but we'll just kind of ignore that. Last time we got up to 81.14 kilos. See how we do this time. Gone. 62.05. Still a reasonable result, but now to write home about, not as good as last time. I'm not going to run this one again because I don't use drywall screws for woodworking. Hooky dooky, test number 3. Right, this is the one I'm most intrigued about. The TurboGold 4x45mm. Posi drive head. Last time we got up to the best result of all the kind of normal screws. We got up to 157.6 kilos. Let's see how it does this time with the pilot hole. One 4.77, not quite as good, and it's still split the MDF anyway, so this one seems to have obliterated the MDF a lot more than last time. Let me just show you. You'll be able to see the split in the MDF as well. Still actually got a fairly decent hold in the MDF, but you can see how it's just completely pulled the inners of the MDF out. But we've got this crack running right across, even though it was piloted. It didn't crack going in, mind. So there was no crack until the pull-out test was done. On to the next one. Right, test number 4. This is the 4x50 gold screw. Posi drive head again on it. Last time this got up to 122.4 kilos. Let's see how it does this time. That's it gone, 120.31. Very, very close to the last result. You might as well say zero difference there. Okie doke. Right, test number 5. This is a Spax Specialist MDF screw, 4x50mm Torx head on it. Last time This one got up to 130.43 kilos. Let's see how it does this time. Gone 99. 99, and it split the MDF as well. So even with the pilot hole, it's still got, I'll show you, bloody screws jammed. So you can see the big kind of split running all the way from about there, all the way along to about there. As I say, it didn't split going in, only split when the pull-out test was running. Right, Conformat screw. Last time this got up to the ridiculous 228.71 kilos. Someone rightly pointed out in the comments as well that kind of the shoulder or the neck of the screw just below the head's a little bit wider than the rest of the thread. So I've added a spacer just to compensate for that. Let's go for it and see what this goes up to. So we're now on a 5mm pilot hole instead of the 4mm, and we've got this spacer just to account for the wider shank, would it be, or a collar of the screw. There's been no splitting this time of the screw going in, which is a better sign than before. 228.7 to beat. Well, what do you know? 154.8. Big difference. And massive split in the MDF as well. Let me just show you that. So you can see the spacer that I used there. And you can see giant split running all the way down. So this is an interesting one. It might have got the lower result because of the spacer and the fact that there's less thread now in the MDF. I will run this a couple more times just to check whether it's a spacer to blame or if it's just something to do with the fact that we had the bigger pilot hole on this. Remember, we had the 4mm pilot hole last time. This time it had the 5mm pilot hole. But either way, didn't split going in, but split coming out. And still did amazingly well, but not as well as last time. Right, final test. And this is the long drywall screw, the 4x62 Phillips head drywall screw. Last time got up to 145 kilos or thereabouts. Let's see how we do this time with the pilot hole. I think that's it. Gone at 162. Well and truly gone. Good result, but bear in mind this is a much longer screw, longer than the other ones, and it split really split the wood on this one. Right, so time for us to run a couple of these tests again, and then we'll go through the results. Okay, so I have before me here the results of the tests, and it's quite full on, I'm afraid. Things got a little bit complicated, and to cut a long story short, I had to run the test 40 times, and I've actually ended up adding an 8th test into the mix, and that is the TurboGold 4x50mm screws. They weren't included as part of last week's test, but I will explain why I've added them in a bit. So, I know a lot of you just want me to kind of cut to the chase and tell you which screw to use, which is fine, but I know a lot of you also want to know a little bit more of the science behind it and how I've kind of got to my conclusions. So what I'm going to do is tell you now what I think are the best screws to use, and then if you're interested, I'll take you through my full kind of analysis of the results so you can see how I got to that conclusion. In my humble opinion, if you're screwing into the edge grain of MDF, I would suggest you go for the TurboGold 4x50mm screw as a good kind of general purpose everyday screw that'll cover you for the vast majority of situations you're going to run into. Now, it's completely up to you. I think using a pilot hole is pointless. The TurboGold screws have a self-drilling tip on them and a rifled shank, so they're kind of drilling their way into the MDF anyway. And although the results with the pilot hole were better than the results without were still staggeringly high results. So I just don't see a situation where you're going to need that kind of loading on a single screw. And if you do want something more beefy than the kind of results we're getting from the 4x50, then I would suggest going for the Conformat screw with a 5mm pilot hole. So that's kind of my takeaway from all of this. TurboGold 4x50 for general purpose stuff, Conformat screw for anything, especially if you're getting into like flat pack stuff that you might have to take apart and put back together. And if you wanted it to be a bit more beefy than the TurboGold, the Conformat's probably your route to go down. But honestly, for me, 99% of situations are now going to be more than covered off by the TurboGold 4x50. Remember as well, this is just my humble opinion. If you've got screws that you're happy using and you're comfortable with them, continue doing what you're doing. All of them performed amazingly well. Anyway, let me explain how I got to my conclusion. Okay, so we've got a lot of results here. 40 separate tests that I've had to run. And we need to simplify this a bit, otherwise it's not going to make any sense to anyone, including myself. So, effectively, we've got two sets of tests. We've got a set of tests that we've run with no pilot hole, and a set of tests that we've run with a pilot hole. Just to simplify matters a little bit to start off with, we're going to take some of these out of the equation so we don't have to worry about them anymore, because it's just kind of cluttering things and making things more complicated than it needs to be. So we're going to take out the drywall screw test for the 3.5x38. I mean, you can see one with no pilot hole did better than the one with a pilot hole. Whether or not it would have averaged out a little bit more if we'd run the test a few more times, it's anyone's guess, but it's not a screw I would generally use. I know a lot of people do use it, which is why I included it in the test, but there's only so many tests that can run. So this is going to get excluded for now. The other one we're going to exclude is this drywall screw here. Again, we've got a pretty good result with a 2mm pilot hole. On this test, the piloted screw did better than the non-piloted screw by quite a way, but you know, I only ran the test once. It's a much longer screw anyway, so of course it's going to do better because it's a longer screw. It's just not a screw I would use. If it's a screw you would use, you can do your own tests, but I'm just not including that. I need to kind of simplify things down a little bit. The other ones that I'm going to rule out is the gold screw. The gold screw, you can see, was coming out at about 120 on both tests, so whether or not it had a pilot hole made very little difference. Again, maybe if I'd ran the test a few more times, you would have seen a bigger difference, but the key thing is that it's a worse result than the TurboGold. So one of the main reasons I included the gold screw is that it doesn't have the self-drilling tip on it, and I wasn't sure if that would affect the results in a positive way or a negative way. And the answer is it's affected it nominally in a negative way, but really, I mean, if you compare it between that, the TurboGold and the gold screw, not a huge difference. So we're just going to basically ignore that one as well. We're also going to ignore the Conformat screw. Now, the Conformat, I did run 2 separate tests on. So we ran the initial test that you saw last week, and that was where it came out nearly quarter of a ton. And that was with the 4mm pilot hole. But someone rightly pointed out in the comments that maybe it should have had a spacer on it so that it wasn't splitting the wood as much. Of course, if it's got a spacer on it, there's not as much thread going down into the wood. So when I repeated that with the spacer, it got a result of 160.1. Draw what you want from that. The Conformat, it's a great screw for the job, but it's a pain in the backside to use. You've got to drill a massive pilot hole. You need a clearance hole in the thing that you're actually attaching, and it leaves a hex head on it, which is another downside of it. So it's not a standard head. I know you can get Conformat screws with like a posi drive head or whatever, but for me, the pros aren't really outweighing the cons on the Conformat. Maybe if you're building flat pack furniture or stuff that regularly needs to be taken to bits and put back together, but to me, it's not a significant enough difference. Yeah, okay, we're 194 kilos, but you're talking about, that's a colossal amount of load to put on a single screw. And, you know, anything above like 100 is good. So 194, very good. And if we look at it with the, now I've got this in the 2mm pilot hole just because I had nowhere else to put it. For the Conformat, this is when I tested it with the 5mm pilot hole. So here was the 4mm pilot hole, and over on this side was with the 5mm pilot hole. I ran that test twice, both with the spacer, came out 154.8 and 146.1. And by the way, this column here is just an average. So we're doing an average across whatever is on each test run, if that makes sense. So what we're basically saying is, with the spacer and doing a 5mm pilot hole, although it didn't split the MDF as much, it didn't get as good a result as with the 4mm pilot hole. So again, draw from that what you will. Whether or not you want to use a 4mm or a 5mm, I would suggest probably the 5mm pilot hole for these, just because it splits the MDF less, even though it doesn't get as good a result as with the 4mm pilot hole. So personally, if you're using a Conformat, I would use, let me just, I'm going to grey that out just so we know that we're forgetting about it, but I would use, I'm going to put a little green thing on it, just so you know, this is the one that I would go for. So the 5mm pilot hole. Let me just write it here so we don't forget. 5mm pilot. And here is 4mm pilot. Okie doke. So the other one that we're going to ignore is the silver screw, because you would never generally use a tiny little short screw like that into the edge grain of MDF. But what we have interestingly shown here, I did run the test 3 times on each. I actually ran it a 4th time, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But ignore that. I'm not including that 4th run on the no pilot hole. I'm not including that in the average. You'll see my average calculation there is just taking into account runs 1, 2 and 3. And we can see that with the pilot hole, it did nominally better than without. The point is that it did terribly compared to going into the face grain. That was the only reason for including this screw in the test, was just to show you what a big difference it makes going into the edge grain versus going into the face grain, and why you need a much beefier screw going into the edge grain of MDF. If you are going to use a really short screw into the edge grain of MDF, which I'm not sure why you would, but if you are, I would suggest you use a pilot hole. So here's our green little blob for that. So that basically means we've narrowed it down to 3 different screws. So if you remember from the tests that we did last week, this was where we got this really high figure on the TurboGold 4.5 by 45 of 157.6. Let me just highlight this so you know which row I'm talking about here. So we're going to have a little chat about the TurboGold 4.5 by 45. So last week when we did the test, we got this really high figure, and I said I need to run this a few more times because that was crazily high. Now, when I've run the test again, the second result I got was quite substantially lower, and then the third run was back in the remit of our first run. So I kind of thought, well, do I ignore this second run or do I test it again? So I tested it again, and we got even lower, 106. I was like, what's going on there? So I tested it again, and we got 112. So, okay, I can't explain that. It could be so many different factors at play here, but basically I've run the test 5 times here. This one I'm going to talk about in a second. That's not included in the average. Again, the average is between these 5 results here. And what we've got here, I don't know. It could be down to imperfections or inconsistencies within the MDF itself. It could be me using a different amount of torque to screw the screw in. There's so many different factors. It could be humidity. The point is, I don't think any of these results can be dismissed. And all I've done is I've taken an average of all of them. We've got a range from 106 to 157 here, coming out at an average of 129 kilos. It's still a crazy amount of load on a single screw. Not something you're ever going to really run into in the real world. But if you are going to use TurboGold 4.5 by 45mm screw, this is the average of what I got when I didn't use a pilot hole. Now, interestingly, when I did use a pilot hole, 2mm pilot, here's the results I got. And again, quite a broad range, all the way from 106, which is pretty much what we saw over with no pilot. But we didn't get anywhere near as high as the figures with the pilot hole. So, when we take the average of these 4 runs, let me just show you. So we're averaging between those 4, coming out at 122.1. So we're actually slightly lower with the pilot hole. So if you're going to use a 4.5 by 45 screw into MDF, it seems to do better with no pilot. So we're little green blobs going to go on this one. Now, okay, let's talk about the Spax screw. Spax Specialist MDF screw. I was a bit disappointed with this one, to be honest. It's not a screw that I tend to use very often. And, okay, we've got results from 130, 104, 106 with no pilot, and with a pilot hole, 99, 121, 103. So, we're getting a better result with no pilot hole. So, if you are going to use them, you probably, my interpretation is that you probably don't need to bother piloting it. At the end of the day, the screw's designed with that self-drilling tip on it anyway. But, well, jury's out. You know, my interpretation is that you're getting a better result with no pilot hole. In either case, they're too much of a pain in the neck for me. The Torx bit doesn't grip the tip of the screw very well. It tends to kind of fall out of the tip when you're using them. You can't preload the driver with a screw and then use it at an angle because it just falls off. You have to put quite a substantial amount of pressure behind the screw when you're drilling it into the wood because it's got that weird tip on it that doesn't kind of drive itself into the wood. And at the end of the day, it's not getting as good a load bearing as these other screws. So, you know, if you're happy using them and you're used to these screws, you go for it. You're into the realms of, you know, well beyond my body weight on a single screw. But to me, it just doesn't, the pros don't outweigh the cons. So, not for me. So the final screw that I wanted to talk about was TurboGold 4x50, which is the new one to our list, which I didn't film because I wasn't going to include that in the test, but it's only when I've seen all the other results that I thought, well, maybe I should include that, because at least then we're talking about the same size, 4x50, to give a direct comparison against the SPAX screw. And look at the results we've got here. Really interesting. So, with no pilot hole, 104, 156, back in the remit of what we were getting with the TurboGold, 135 and 121. So we're averaged out at 129.5, which is almost exactly the same as what we got from the TurboGold 4.5x45. So basically what we've done, we've added 5mm to the length and taken 0.5mm off the width, and look at that, at how close they are. 129.3, 129.5. Note between them, really. But the interesting thing is when we come to do the test with the pilot hole, and what we're seeing here is 154.1, 188.5, and 156. Really impressive results there. So 166.2 kilos as the average. For me, does it outweigh the hassle of having to kind of get the pilot drill out? At the end of the day, it's a self-drilling tip anyway. And we're still getting 129 kilos on that single screw. There was very little damage to the MDF, very little cracking in either case. So, for me, I'm going to say don't bother piloting. But that's very much up to you. We're getting 129 kilos average with very little visible damage to the MDF. So why bother giving you... Okay, we're getting an extra 30 odd kilos, but do you need that? So, okay, this is one of these things where on paper it's better to pilot. It's better to pilot for this screw in this situation. But in the real world, not piloting, it's not going to make much difference. And I ran this test 4 times, by the way, just to try and get... You saw I was getting 104, 156, quite a wide range of results. That's why I did an extra 4th test on the non-piloted ones. So, okay. Right. The only other thing left to talk about is these little anomaly results here. Let me just highlight them in some sort of colour that you can actually read. We've got an anomaly result there and an anomaly result here. When I ran through the TurboGold tests, one of the things that crossed my mind is, okay, well, if we're getting 157.6 on one of the tests, I mean, that's crazily high load on a single screw. Maybe it's something to do with the density of the MDF. So I thought, okay, because I've just been doing these tests on Medite standard non-moisture resistant MDF, just because that's probably something around that kind of ballpark is probably going to be the most common stuff in use throughout the world. It's not going to be like your mega fancy MDFs, and you know, it's how far do you want to push it. But what I did want to try was the Medite MR MDF, because I know that that is higher density MDF. It does have a tighter grain structure to it, and yeah, look at that. When I've run the test on the Medite MR, 203.6 kilos on a single screw. I mean, we're approaching what we got on the Conformat screws, but that's into the MR. So watch this space. I will be doing more tests in the future to do more comparisons between moisture resistant and non-moisture resistant MDF. This really confirms for me that if possible, if you can get the MR MDF, but this is just one brand of MR, who's to say that if you use a different brand of moisture resistant MDF, maybe it makes no difference. maybe it's just a Medite MR where you happen to be able to get a better screw loading in the edge grain of the MDF. We're getting to the nth degree of testing here. I don't want too many variables in this, so this was just a little bit of fun really. And then I thought, well, if I'm going to try that test for the moisture resistant, let's try our silver screw, the first test we did. Let's also try that in the Medite MR and look at that. 36.6. We got better than anything we've done other than this 2mm pilot hole test where we got 39.7, but still better than the average on the pilot hole test. So I need to think of a conclusion to come up with here, and I would say, okay, silver screw, you're not going to be doing anything with in the edge grain of MDF, so we can kind of ignore that. Drywall screw, I've already said we're ignoring. The 4.5 by 45, I would say don't use that and use the 4 by 50 instead, because we're getting a very similar result but less cracking of the MDF. Gold screw, nah, not to write home about really. I would stick to the TurboGold with the self-drilling tip on it. It seems to get a much better result. The sparks, for me, isn't worth the hassle. The Conformat are great. If you are going to do it, I would do it with the 5mm pilot. So, although we've kind of ruled that out from the test, I am going to include that as one of our winners. Drywall screw we've ruled out. And for me, the winner's got to be the 4x50 TurboGold. So, that's how I got to the results. So there you have it. Sorry for the gargantuanly long video this has ended up turning into. Hopefully it's of some use to you. A few of you suggested putting some glue into the hole or around the thread of the screw before screwing it in. That's something I might test on a future video. But personally, well, I would certainly suggest you glue the overall joint, absolutely. Personally, I don't think there's any point in also gluing the thread of the screw. I mean, at the end of the day, if we're getting 130 kilos on a single screw without glue, I just don't see the point in it. And plus, once the glue joint has dried, that's going to take over from any loading that's on the screw anyway, because your glue joint's going to withstand way more than the screw can withstand. I'm not saying don't do it. If you want to put glue on your screws, fill your boots. Also, a couple of you mentioned that screws in MDF are generally subject more to shear loads rather than pull-out loads. I completely agree. The reason we're doing pull-out tests is because it's about the only test that you can do that's a repeatable test that can be directly compared against other types of fittings. Shear load tests introduce a whole load of other factors, like how much glue you use in the joint, how big the joint is, how many screws you use, whether you've got biscuits or dominoes in the joint as well. There's so many other variables that come into play on a shear load test that, for the purposes of this particular test, I just wanted to get a direct strength comparison of pull forces. We'll cover off shear loads on a separate video. If I introduce too many variables into this particular test, the results are going to become completely meaningless. Remember, as usual, don't go off my results for anything important that you're doing. This is just a bit of fun. Always go by the manufacturer's guidelines. I'm only talking about peak loads here. I haven't taken any safety factors into account. It's very normal to use a safety factor of 3 or 4, sometimes as high as 7. So with a safety factor of 7, a 130 kilo load comes down to about 20 kilos. As usual, I'll put the full results over on gosforthhandyman.com when I get a chance. Bear with me on that one, keep an eye on Twitter. For now, I best get this edited, otherwise I'm going to have to rename this Test Wednesday instead of Test Tuesday. See you next time.